I'm Ellis, and as usual, at Banana Jam Games, today we wanted to talk about Fire Me, I Insist. More specifically, looking back at everything that we've learnt over the course of the 3 months development, which is a typically shorter development cycle than most indie games. But if you're keen on making a game within that short amount of time, what considerations should you make before you get started, before you even plan the game, and start drafting a game design document? Here is everything we learned from the development of Fire Me, I Insist, 2 days from launch. The first thing is that you don't have to have absolutely everything planned. If you understand the gameplay cycle of your game, and you know what features you want to put in the game, then you're already halfway there. As long as you know the general structure and functionality that you're going to need to put in from a coding perspective, some of the other features and details can be added in at a later point. The best example we have for this on Fire Me, I Insist would be the evidence for all of the characters. We had planned and already knew that each character was going to have 3 pieces of evidence required to find them guilty of some sort of degenerate behaviour, and that this evidence would be sprinkled about the office Monday to Friday 9 to 5 across various rooms. What we hadn't necessarily figured out by the time we started working on the game was exactly what evidence was going to show up for certain people. Essentially meaning we knew that we were having 3 pieces of evidence for each character and that we would need the functionality to find that evidence, whether it was hidden behind a safe puzzle, in a secondary interior, like the bins in our case, or that it was a piece of evidence that you would have to photograph and use the HUD to collect. But what we didn't necessarily know was what that piece of evidence was going to be for each character. So you can get relatively far into development without having confirmed what these minor details are going to be. So what I'm trying to say is that if you have a feature in your game, then you know the functionality beforehand and you can implement that. You don't necessarily have to know the art or the dialogue or the specific object that you're thinking of in your head, because details like this are just based on artwork and what your description of the item might be, and in our case, what the description in the journal was of this evidence. We knew that this was something that could be added in later, and that it wasn't going to break the game once we did add it in. So if these little pieces of information are what's holding you back from finishing your game design document, skip over it. You can always come back and add it at a later point. However, having said that, if you know what 2 functions are going to be in your game and that one function might actually create a bit of a problem for another function, whether that's because it needs to interact or because one will be reliable on the other's outcomes, it's better to figure out what these challenges are going to be earlier on, where the conflicts arise, and start preempting them. Whether you work something into the game design that kind of combats the issues that are probably going to arise, or whether you find a way to circumnavigate them altogether and avoid the issue ever coming up. But regardless, the earlier that you start to work on ironing out this problem and getting it dealt with, the easier it will be. You don't necessarily want to come to the end of your 3-month development cycle thinking everything's fine and then still have a big problem waiting for you that you need to solve, especially if you haven't considered the problem in advance and you have no idea how big the problem is going to be. Our example of this was when certain characters were fired in Fire Me, I Insist, and subsequently certain interactions between 2 characters at the same time didn't make sense. One was spouting off dialogue that was meant to be them engaging with the other character or interacting with them. Didn't really make sense if one of them had been fired and that dialogue remained. So whilst we had a cohesive list of dialogue from 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, 11 lines for each character, we had to go back and alter some lines and then get the game to understand that if this character was fired, make that check, and then change the dialogue to this new set that we had produced for all of our characters. Luckily, James is pretty hot on all of this stuff, and so he knew how to fix this quite quickly. But again, this was an issue that we did or should have known was going to be a problem earlier, and that should have been addressed at an earlier point, rather than us chasing our tail 3-4 weeks from release. Basically, don't put your head in the sand and try and deal with things as early as you can, if you know that it's going to be quite a significant problem towards the end. We didn't think this was a massive problem for a while, but towards the end we realised we wanted to make sure that Fire Me, I Insist was a polished and finished product that worked, and that didn't have these little caveats that we make where we would just sit there and go, it's our first game, it's not a problem. We wanted to make sure that it was quality. The next thing we would probably advise is to not sign yourself up for these large creative tasks that you know, or that you can potentially know in advance, will take up a lot of time, and also be dependent on a lot of creativity and imagination that may come and go in waves for you. Again, our example of this with Fire Me, I insist, was the 3,000 plus lines of dialogue we signed ourselves up to write. Now, originally we thought this wouldn't be a problem at all. However, after maybe 1,500 lines of dialogue that myself and James started to create, it started to get a bit tedious, and also I think creativity started to plummet. Now, this didn't end up being a huge issue, and we did get it completed on time, and we did have fully fleshed out characters with various personality traits, interests, hobbies, and lives outside of the office. But that doesn't stop the fact that sitting there writing lines of dialogue for 8 hours a day potentially really does start to drain the creativity and ideas you have in your head. Whilst myself and James were lucky that we had each other in this regard, and we essentially quality checked each other's work, that doesn't take away from the fact that some dialogue might have been when either of us was in a headspace that we really didn't have new ideas, and so some of the dialogue started to look half-baked, and some characters actually just started to speak less. Everybody gets writer's block and other creative stumbling blocks, so if you are going to sign yourself up for a large creative task, whether that's a significant amount of dialogue, significant amount of art, or the need to create various different enemies, just bear in mind that your creativity might peak and trough, and sometimes not be as instant or accessible as you'd want it to be. And that again, you could be in a position where potentially this being slowed down starts bringing the whole development cycle itself to a slower pace than you originally wanted to. The next thing we'd recommend if you are making a game in a very short, maybe 3-month development cycle, is that Steam takes a bit of cooking, as it were. You can't sign up to Steamworks and then have your game on the store the next day for release. There are several steps that Steam takes to make sure that garbage isn't being uploaded onto their site willy-nilly, and that people have taken time, and that all of the products on there are approved by Steam and investigated to ensure there's no wrongdoing, which I for one think is actually quite good. But in the case of putting your game on Steam, it might be a bit more work than other platforms like itch. Steam will have several points where they will want to look at your game over a number of days. This is usually 3 to 5 days from the time that you upload the files for your game. And they also do this separately both for the demo and the full game, which means if you're considering a demo, again, you want to give yourself a week, preferably 2, just in case there's any issues with the first authentication that Steam does. And then again, do the exact same for your full game file. Add on top of this the various other things you need to upload to Steam, so your marketing resources, a trailer, screenshots, potentially GIFs to go in the description, any and all financial information you need to give them, setting the different prices for different regions, which Steam does give you a bit of help with, having its own tool to show the affordability of different countries and what will likely actually work and be affordable for people, and just giving you a better understanding of the exchange rate. What might cost £10 here would only cost the equivalent of £5 in other countries because of their economic situation. But if you're dead set on putting your game on Steam, then essentially what you want to do is give yourself a good amount of time. The more time you have, the better chances you have that your Steam is going to run smoothly and you won't be chasing your tail to make sure that the checks are done and that your game can actually be released. After all of these checks, you also have a 2-week window where essentially your game needs to be classified as coming soon, and once this is done, you can put a release date on there and stick to it. So arguably, if you're going to make a game within 3 months, chances are you need the game done and ready to upload around about the 2-month mark if you want to confirm that it's going to work on Steam and be released at the date that you want. The next thing we have learned is that point and click is not necessarily a viable, trendy, or profitable genre at the moment. Whether it's because of the simplistic nature of its coding or because of the flooding that the market essentially has had, with the Steam market having around about 7,000 games of a point and click nature. These type of games are not attention grabbing, and most people nowadays are looking for interesting games that have interesting functionality. Add on top of this that most 2D games that make a big splash in the market usually have something unique about them that does draw attention. Find Me, I Insist does apparently not hit that mark. Whilst we thought our unique selling point would be the interesting nature of the characters and the satire on the office as a workplace and the various characters in it with their terrible behaviours, I'd say that in 2025 people are looking for unique concepts and also unique features and functionality within games, not necessarily unique stories or characters. And that's if you'd even regard them as unique. But regardless of popularity, profitability, and any other factors that you would normally consider to be quite important from a business side of developing a game, as two indie devs, we are still really happy with Find Me, I Insist, and it could turn around and shock us by having a flood of people buy the game on the day of release, but we're not expecting that, and we're not going to be disheartened if that doesn't happen. The last thing that I would touch on is marketing a game. I've mentioned certain parts in the previous chapter, but marketing games is tricky, with seemingly no single platform having more or less of a gamer's demographic. Essentially what I mean is that there is no social media that is more popular than any other amongst gamers, and it seems fairly flat across the board, with the biggest way to market your games usually being through content creators and influencers. This is usually because you're not only getting a good understanding of the game, but you're also seeing somebody's impression of it, whether it's fun, terrifying, or extremely competitive and has a rewarding gameplay loop. And then if you're some sort of freak, maybe you just like battle passes and spending 20 minutes to get a pop-up that says winner winner chicken dinner. Regardless, it seems that only certain games will not necessarily go viral, but have a really good marketing run. And it's usually games that have a really unique hook that another game hasn't done before. But again, not just in terms of concept, story, or characters, but in terms of functionality and how you actually play the game. The idea of going into an environment and using point and click functionality to pick up items, navigate a menu, and click a button to complete one of the 9 tasks is not necessarily a new way of playing a game. However, for a short amount of time, the first-person horror, go into a building, get pictures, or get objects worth value, for a time was quite new. And as such, we've seen numerous different games do that in the past 2-3 years. In a similar way to the social deduction games that, again, weren't necessarily mainstream for a long time, with simpler games like Town of Salem being web-based, eventually coming to Steam, and then the game being thrown apart for a much quicker and fast-paced version, which also allowed for more movement, otherwise being known as Among Us, which again was popularised by influencers and content creators. So what I'm trying to say is that marketing will be a bit of a bitch, and the earlier you can consider that in your development and game design cycle, the better. Another thing that you may want to consider in regards to marketing and also audience and the market itself is that a lot of older people in gaming, over the age of 18 for instance, might predominantly use gaming for socialization nowadays, keeping in touch with friends whilst also doing an activity that's not as harmful as going down to your local spoons. And what that means is that a lot of people might only spend money on games that are multiplayer nowadays. That is not a sweeping analogy, and I know it does not fit everybody, but there is a larger market out there who potentially now are also getting kids and don't generally have the time to play games as often as they'd like. And so when they do play games, they're using it to socialise with their friends who maybe live further afield. And that's pretty much it from us at Banana Jam Games. Find Me, I Insist was a fun and interesting project to make, and as it releases now on the 17th of March, we will see the fruits of our labour, and whether or not, as much fun as it was, the game is going to be profitable. You could technically say it is to an extent, as what we arguably really only spent on it was the Steam fee to put the game on there. But in terms of a time spent and costs covered argument, whether or not Find Me, I Insist is commercially successful is another question that is yet to be seen. However, we have started to work on a new project, and we will hopefully be sharing details of that with you soon. But if you wanted to take a look in advance, by all means, go down to the description and look at our Kickstarter page for that next project. I've been Ellis, and thank you for watching.